Hello ladies and gentlemen, once again this is Jeremy Smith. I pray you guys are all doing well during this pandemic time. Hopefully soon this will all be over and we'll return to the previous version of normal we knew before all this. As time is going on, I have had a chance to get my hands on some cameras once again and start doing more testing. And yes, I realize that all of YouTube is going nuts over Nikon's new Z6 II and Z7 II, and frankly I'm not going to jump into all that at this time, because really I'm not into discussing cameras I haven't had my hands on. Besides, I think that Nikon actually has a very much more important release that's come out lately, other than the Z6 II and Z7 II, and that is their Z5. Why do I say that the Z5 is a bigger deal than the Z6 II and the Z7 II? Stick around, and we'll go into this in more detail. Taking a closer look at the Nikon Z5, you guys will no doubt notice that it bears a strong resemblance to its bigger sibling, the Z6. Initially, I thought this camera was actually smaller than the Z6, but as it turns out, the Z6 is actually a couple millimeters thinner. Basically, this means they're the same size. One thing that does make the Z5 a bit more compact package is the fact that it ships with Nikon's new 24-50 lens. Like many mirrorless lenses, this lens is designed to be very compact. You guys will notice that it does actually unfold like this, and if you're storing it, basically you can compact it down like this to allow you to have a little bit smaller package to carry around. This smaller design, unfortunately, does come at the expense of a little bit of aperture. You guys will notice that it's an f4 to 6.3. Not very great as far as like low light goes, but the upside to this is that this lens does seem to be very sharp, and it seems to focus well also. Perhaps in a future video we'll take a closer look at this lens and discuss some of its qualities, but just know that it's actually a very good lens as long as you can live with the slightly slower aperture. If you wanted to, you could always pair this camera with one of Nikon's excellent Z series primes, or you might even opt to go for something like the 24-70 f4. This camera isn't bundled in a kit with any of those lenses, but you could always just buy it body only and then put whatever lens you want with it. If we take a look at the back of the camera, you guys will notice that it basically has the exact same type of layout that we see on the other Z models. When the Z cameras first came out, a lot of people didn't seem to like that all the controls were sort of like off to the right hand side. I don't think this is a big deal. I mean, yes, a lot of Nikon users were used to being able to hold the camera here and then press buttons on this side, but I think they've still done a good job with the layout here. We do have a I button here. Well, we have an I option on the screen and we have an I button. This allows us to bring up our little I menu display. So you can actually go in here and if you want to change something, like in this case, maybe I want to change my white balance. I can go in here and select that option. And then this screen allows me to go through and change everything like this. So that works out pretty well. If you wanted to go in here and maybe customize what options you have on the screen, you can go into your menu, and under your custom functions, you will find an option here for controls. And at the very top there, you will see that there is an option to customize the I menu. And yeah, once you find something, like maybe I don't want to have the white balance there, I can select this, and then I can customize to my heart's content. There's a lot of options. Now, if you're the type of photographer that would prefer to change things with buttons instead, you do have some dedicated buttons here. We do have an option for our drive modes, for example, here. There's also a top button for our ISO, and this is very nice. This is something that Nikon has been doing on their newer cameras for quite some time now, and this allows us to be able to go in here and change the ISO much more easily just by pressing and holding the button and rotating the rear dial. If you want to go to auto ISO, press and hold the same button, but then you just rotate the dial up here. It requires a little bit of finger gymnastics, but as you guys can see, it works out really well. The auto ISO toggles on and off just like that. In addition to these buttons, we still have our joystick, so kudos to Nikon for not taking that off, even though this is more of an entry-level kind of model, at least entry-level full frame. Then you also notice we have some function buttons up here. These buttons also can be customized in the menu. By default though, they're going to do a couple things for us. If we go to our function 1, you can see I'm pressing and holding it. I'm just holding it down with my middle finger there. And as I rotate this rear dial, we're going through all of our white balance settings. If I do the exact same thing and press the lower function button, the function button 2, I can go in here and change our focus drive modes if I rotate the back wheel like this. So you can see we toggle between manual focus, between the AFS, between AFC. Now, if I want to go in here and change the focus area mode, I press that same button, but then I just rotate the front wheel up here. And you can notice that we get our different focus area mode. So we can do the entire auto area. I can have a little bit smaller area if I want. We can even go all the way down to pen, which allows us to select a very, very small area. Actually, the pen only works if you're an AFS, but there it is right there. So you can change between all these different functions. So pretty cool. Now, as far as the back screen, it is a little bit lower quality than what we see on the higher models. It's roughly $1 million less, I believe, than something like the Z6. This is not really a big deal in my opinion. I'm not really sure why photographers are really making a big deal about rear screen resolution on mirrorless cameras. If you really want to get the best review ability, I recommend just going in and going to your playback mode. You can always raise the camera up to your eye and then just use the EVF to see your image as opposed to the back screen. It's going to be way higher resolution. The EVF on this camera is 3.69 million dots. So that's another thing I like on this camera is that Nikon did not compromise the EVF resolution just because this is more of their entry-level full-frame model. This still gets the exact same EVF as even the higher-end models like the very latest Z7 II and Z6 II. If we take a look at the side of the camera, I'll go ahead and get it out of the way. You guys know that I'm very picky about my little port cover doors for whatever reason. It's a strange obsession I have, but yeah, I'm not a fan of these doors. But the upside is they do cover some nice ports that are good to see. I love the fact that we have a USB-C port on this camera. USB-C is awesome because now not only can we charge our battery inside the camera, but it's also nice to be able to not have to fiddle with a bunch of different cables for different cameras. I have a whole drawer full of tether tools, cords that I no longer have to use because I can just use USB-C on everything. So that's a very, very nice addition. And for those of you that want to do some video, you do have a microphone jack and a headphone jack. They do let us be able to access these independently of each other, so we don't have to open up the entire flap for both those, so that's a nice thing too. Now, in regards to our battery, this camera actually uses a little bit different battery. As I just mentioned, it does USB charge, but this camera gets a battery called the ENEL15C. So basically, first of all, if you have an older Nikon DSLR camera that uses a battery before the ENEL15C or B, those batteries will still work in this camera. In order to USB charge, you have to have the newer ENEL15B or ENEL15C. As far as the differences between the ENEL15B that the Z6 and previous models shipped with versus this newer ENEL15C, from what I've been able to tell, this battery is apparently more efficient about delivering its power, and this camera actually does get about roughly 100 shots more per charge than the Z6. Although I kind of suspect that has more to do with the processing. This camera uses an XP6 processor, but basically in this camera, Nikon is not working it quite as hard because you'll notice if we come over and do something like, say, our continuous shooting, so we're on continuous high now, this camera is going to do a maximum of 4.5 frames per second. On something like the Z6, you're looking at 12 frames per second, and on the Z6 II, you're looking at 14 frames a second. So if you need very, very fast speed, the Z6 or Z6 II is definitely going to be a better way to go. Now, if you're a portrait photographer like me, this is not really going to be a big deal. I mean, 4.5 frames a second is going to be sufficient for portrait shooters, for landscape shooters. Yeah, but if you want more speed, obviously the higher models are there for you. Another area where we see a little bit of a difference in performance with this camera is going to be in regards to its video ability. So if we go in, and I'm going to go to my video functions, let's see, we'll go here. And right now it's in 4K 30. We're going to switch the camera over to 4K, we're going to switch the camera over to 1080 60. Okay, so if we do this, if I go into our video mode here, you guys will notice this is the width that we get. But as soon as I go in and go to something like 4K, you will notice that we don't have as wide of a field of view. And that's because this camera does have a little bit of a crop factor. I believe it's 1.7 times crop factor whenever you're in 4K. So if you need full width video in 4K, that's again where the Z6 is going to come in. Now, if you're going to record to an external recorder, do note that this camera still has the same high quality 10-bit out at 422. So you're not really losing anything there. But yeah, in 4K internal, you are, actually at any 4K, you're still dealing with that crop factor. Another area where you're going to see a bit of a difference is if you want to do slow motion, this camera maxes out at 60 frames a second in 1080, whereas something like the Z6 can actually do 120 frames a second in 1080, and so can the Z7. If you bump up to that newer Z6 II or Z7 II, those cameras apparently are going to be able to do 4K at 60 frames. So if you're a very, very serious video user, obviously Nikon is still putting plenty of distinction between this entry-level full frame versus their higher-end models. So that's something worth mentioning too. Now we get to something that's very exciting. We come over to this side of the camera. Okay, wait for it. Bam! There it is. Dual card slots. I am convinced that if Nikon and Canon had put dual card slots in their new mirrorless cameras, we wouldn't be dealing with the global pandemic right now. All jokes aside, this camera does actually use dual cards. They are SD cards. So yeah, that's a big thing that a lot of people were wanting to see. Now, right now I just have a pretty slow, kind of middle of the road UHS-I style card in the camera. And the buffer performance actually does pretty well, or shall I say buffer clearing performance. Honestly guys, I'm a portrait kind of guy. I don't shoot fast. I think with the standard UHS-I card, you're going to be plenty fast enough, like a UHS-I U3. You guys can see that the buffer didn't take too long to clear. We're shooting RAW plus JPEG fine right now. If you do want that buffer to clear faster, it is important to note though that this camera can actually support the higher speed UHS-II style memory card. So that's something worth considering. So that's basically the Z5. I think that this is going to be Nikon's most important camera to date in their mirrorless lineup. Even over the Z6 II and the Z7 II, because this has some really, really wide range appeal in the marketplace. This guy is $1,400 USD for the body. You're getting a lot of camera for that price point. If you look at Sony, they have the A7 II. That's an older model that they do sell for actually even less than that. But again, it's an older model, it's, it doesn't have the dual card slots, its battery life is not going to be as good as this one, its viewfinder is not as good, etc. And then you have like cameras like, that are a truly terrible compromise in my opinion. Cameras like the EOS RP, which has a Rebel battery, which means it's got awful battery life. I just don't like that camera. So I think Nikon has a win if you compare some of the other entry-level, if you compare this camera to the other entry-level full-frame mirrorless models. The only other thing that I didn't discuss previously about this camera versus the Z6 is that it does use a little bit different type of sensor tech. I'm not going to go super camera nerd, but basically this camera does not have a BSI style sensor, whereas the Z6 does. BSI's backside illumination, basically this means that the Z6 sensor, even though it's still 24 megapixels, each pixel is going to be able to gather a little bit more light, and that's going to translate over to a bit better image quality at high ISO. In the description, you guys can download some raw files. I did not have a Z6 to compare this to, so I shot this camera and the D780. The reason I used the D780 is because I had one around and it uses the same sensor as the Z6. So take a look at the high ISO samples between this camera and that one and tell me in the comments if you can see a difference. I see a little difference, but I don't think it's a huge deal. Anyways, guys, if you have any other questions, feel free to write me about those in the comments as well. And we will definitely be doing more testing soon. Now that Nikon and Canon offer mirrorless models with dual card slots, I'm sure the world will go back to normal pretty soon, and we won't have a global pandemic, and there won't be rioting in the streets and whatnot. Until next time, guys, definitely be sure to follow me on social media. I am known as PhotogJTheGreat. Also, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Until next time, this is Jeremy Smith, signing off.